Mr. Danver. I hadn't thought about it until last week, but it seems to have snowballed into something that's gotten out of control. I was looking through some photos while helping my mother move when I saw him for the first time in 15 years. Dad had passed away a few months ago, and Mom was just starting to clean out some of his things. The picture had been taken at a birthday party, my 9th birthday party, and it showed my friends and I standing in front of the house and smiling as my mom took the picture. There were about 9 of us, all wearing party hats with ice cream mustaches under our noses, but the happy faces of my friends, and I weren't what had caught my eye. It was the gaunt man standing in the window of the living room. The one looking out at us with the empty black eyes and the sinister little smile. A man who had haunted my childhood, though I had never quite believed in him after the age of 12. Mr. Danver, a specter that my late father had brought to life. I remember the first time I ever heard of Mr. Danver, and the memory made my skin crawl. It wasn't scary because of what I had been told, but because of the unwilling way that my father had shared it. I was 5, and we were getting ready to go to preschool. I hadn't slept well the night before, and I was cranky as I sat at the table and picked at my breakfast. I was wearing half my school clothes, 1 sock, no shoes, and I was so far from being ready that when my father saw me, you could just tell he knew we were going to be late. "Come on, kiddo. We need to get a move on. Finish your breakfast, get your clothes on, find your shoes, and let's get on the road." I don't even remember what I said to him. Something snarky and grumpy, and when he turned back to me, he spoke before he had quite made up his mind to. "You better hurry and get ready before Mr. Danver comes to get you." The silence that hung after that statement was enough to make me turn my head to look at him, and that's why I saw him when he slowly put a hand over his mouth. He was looking at me like he'd just sworn, and he was afraid I would start repeating it. He seemed terrified by the notion of what might suddenly come out of my mouth. "Who's Mr. Danver?" I asked, and that seemed to seal the deal. Dad went rigid, not all at once, but slowly, like something petrifying. His eyes stared out at nothing, his mouth opening a little bit as he gasped slightly. His body seemed to be trying to fight whatever was going on and failing, his mind railing against the inevitable. He looked like a landed fish, something struggling to breathe even as it struggled with the hook that had pulled it from the waters of life, and when I asked the question a second time, the hook seemed to find its anchor, and he stopped fighting. He comes for bad kids, naughty kids, and kid who don't listen. He finds where they hide, and they go missing. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He's tall and old with skin so thin. His hair is wisps, gray as tin. His teeth are sharp, his eyes are black. He'll drag you off, and he'll never come back. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. He delivered it all in the well-trained cadence of an off-Broadway actor at an audition. It sounded like something he had repeated 1,000 times, and I realized even then that it was something I would never forget. The scariest part about it wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The voice was so different from Dad's that it was like watching a ventriloquist talk through him. Suddenly, it felt like a stranger was in the house, and I shuddered as a cold chill ran through me. I didn't say anything in the face of that silence, but when I lifted a hand to my eyes, I realized I was crying. Large, silent tears were sliding down my face, and as my dad came out of his trance, he started crying too. He came to scoop me into his arms and pressed me to his chest as he repeated the same thing again and again into my corn silk hair. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. God help me. I'm so sorry." When Mom came home to find us both watching Disney movies on the couch, she asked why he had called out of work and not taken me to school. When he explained the situation in soft tones as he pressed his mouth against her ear, she joined us on the couch and pulled me into her lap. That was the first night I saw the old specter, but it wouldn't be the last. I woke up with the most profound chill I'd ever felt. It ran up my cheek like mice feet, and my eye popped open as I lay in my bed. The room was dark, my toys casting shadows across the floor as the moon crept in through the window, but I knew those spooky shapes were not the source of my discomfort. I could almost imagine that I heard the song Dad had sang as it scampered in with the air conditioning in the vent. I could see the dust motes in the moonbeam as they boogied to that haunting chorus, and as I stared at them, that's when I saw him. He was hunkered in the corner, his knees against his chest, and his arms resting on his knees. He was looking at me from the pit of shadows where he sat, and when he realized I was looking back at him, I saw a wide grin stretch across his face. His toothy mouth stretched ear to ear, and as he stood up, I could hear his joints popping like kindling wood. His hair sat neatly on his head, looking like the hair you saw on zombies in horror movies, and it brushed the ceiling as he stood. He rose until his head nestled in the corner of the ceiling, his frame all of 8 feet tall. He had a hat in his hand, a round thing I would later learn was called a bowler hat, and his arms were covered by a rich black suit coat. He was wearing a suit beneath, but I was only vaguely aware of it. As he rose, the moon casting his features in contrast, I was mesmerized by his eyes. They were dark pits of shadow that looked at me with mirthful knowledge. "Sorry to wake you," he said, his voice sounding like someone who's lost their breath to excitement. "I just wanted a peek. I'm sure I'll get a closer look sometime." "Tu Dalu." I started screaming then, and when Dad came in and turned the light on, there was nothing in the corner but the star stickers that stuck to the ceiling above the spot. Those stickers never glowed again, and I took them down when I noticed and threw them away. I was afraid he had gotten his taint on them. Dad pulled me into a hug, Mom beside him, and hugging me too in an instant, and both of them held me until the shaking stopped. After that, I saw him anytime I did something disobedient. Sometimes I would see him lurking in the corner of my vision if I said something smart to my mom or dad. Sometimes I would feel those black eyes watching me if I didn't do my chores on time. There were a few times when I heard him laughing after I'd gotten angry at my mom, and I was always quick to apologize and make things right. Mr. Danver made me conscious of my actions in a way that I had never been before, and I was a better person because of it. I never saw him when I was rude to my friends, but just the knowledge that he might be watching made me forgive more often, and I was less likely to be cruel to others. Sometimes when I thought about cheating on a test or taking something from a store, I would imagine him just waiting to get me and think better of it. It all culminated when I was 12, on the day I ran away from home. I had been looking forward to a sleepover at my friend's house that weekend, an event that was highly anticipated. Matt had one of these for his birthday every year, and a bunch of us would go to his house and eat junk food and watch movies and tell scary stories and just have the time of our lives. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, and I knew that if Mom found the math test at the bottom of my bag, the one with the big red F on it, I could hang it up. I had buried it deep in my backpack, but not deep enough. Apparently, she had found it before I could make my escape to the party, and we got into a screaming match over it. It was unfair, I told her. I had looked forward to this party for so long, and it wasn't fair that now I didn't get to go. She said that was too bad, and that if parties were more important than my schoolwork, then I needed to get my priorities in order. I was so mad, so furious with my mom, that I did the unthinkable before I could remember the specter of Mr. Danver. I told her I was going whether she gave me permission or not, and walked out the door before she could stop me. I ran up the street, heading for Matt's house, listening to my mom call from behind me. I expected her to be angry. I expected her to be upset. Instead, she just sounded scared. She told me to come back, that we could talk about this, but I was in no mood to listen. I was going to the party, whether she liked it or not, and nothing was going to stop me from getting there. It wasn't until I saw him standing under a burnt-out street lamp that I remembered the looming threat of Mr. Danver. When it began to flicker, I realized it had a little more juice in it. In the flickering light, I could see the tall, thin frame as he grinned at me, his translucent skin clinging to his face like a mask. He had his hat in his hand again, his immaculate suit still looking pristine in the flickering light, and his eyes reflected that flicker like a stuffed animal's. He looked unreal standing in the everyday world, like a piece of Halloween decor that's a little too well made. He was utterly still, his head brushing the bottom of the lamp, but his fingers gave away his excitement. They drummed on the brim of the hat, and it made him look like a dog preparing to yank his lead and give chase. We stood looking at each other for a count of 5 before I turned and shot off towards home. Mr. Danver was coming after me just as fast, but his lack of footfalls made me panic all the more. I turned to look and saw the too tall thing eating up the ground. His long legs moved like a spider's, and he ran like a cartoon character in big exaggerated galumphs. He was gaining on me with every step, his strides twice my own, and I screamed in frustration and terror as I put on an extra burst of speed. To think that a moment of frustration was going to seal my fate forever. I had been hyper-fixated on my behavior for so long, and now a sudden lapse in judgment was going to kill me. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better beware. The wind seemed to bring the hateful words to my mind as it rushed past my ears. When Mr. Danver comes to town, you better be scared. I was scared. I was terrified. And when my house came into view, I was afraid that I would get snatched within view of the front door. Mr. Danver would reach out with one long arm and pull me into the darkness, and I would be gone forever. It would happen just that quick, and no one would know what had gotten me. Correction, my parents would know. They would know, but how could they tell anyone? To admit to such would make them sound nuts, and probably make people think they had been responsible for my disappearance. I turned suddenly, going through the gate and running up the walk, and I felt the icy chill of Mr. Danver's hand as it passed inches from me. I took the steps 2 at a time, praying the door would be unlocked, and when Mom threw it open, I leaped into her arms. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Please, please don't let him take me." I pressed my face against her, not daring to look back out into the yard. Mom whispered that she forgave me, but when she talked to Mr. Danver, her voice was a mixture of rage and old fear. "Get out of here. All is forgiven. There is no misdeed. You cannot take him." I kept my face pressed against my mom, but I still heard Mr. Danver's spidery voice when he answered her. "Another time then." And when I peeked back, he was gone. Dad came home an hour later, getting off early after Mom called him, but I was still shaking and sobbing on the couch. "Why?" I asked him when he came to join me. "Why did you ever tell me about Mr. Danver?" My dad was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer, before signing and saying, "Because it's not something I meant to do. It happens, and someday it will happen to you as well." "Never," I whispered. "I would never do that to my child." I shuddered as he wrapped me in a hug, but I didn't pull away. "Sweetie, you won't have a choice." I didn't have a choice. My father didn't have a choice. No one has a choice. Once you know about him, the knowledge demands to be shared. His name is dark knowledge, a secret shared by many, and it must be served. That was when he told me how he had come to know about Mr. Danver from his father. I was playing with something on the couch when Dad told me to clean my room. I ignored him, wanting to finish my game, and when he said that if I didn't go do it now, he would call Mr. Danver. I looked up when he said it, and the look on his face was confused and afraid. "Dad, your grandpa, wasn't always the nice guy that you know. He joined AA when I was in high school, but before that he was drunk. He could be a mean drunk too, and I should have known better than to hesitate when he asked me to do something. Instead, I asked who Mr. Danver was, and when he sang me the little song, it was the soberest I had seen him until that point. The words were forced out of him like vomit, and when he finished, he threw his arms around me and told me how sorry he was. Dad looked at me then, and his eyes were hollow pits. I saw him in my room that night, and it wasn't the last time either. He told me that when he'd told the story to Mom, the one about his father telling him about Mr. Danver, she had cried and said she had seen him too. Her dad told her too, and one day, You'll tell your kid. You won't want to, but you won't have a choice. The song isn't inevitable as Mr. Danver. What you got there? I jumped as Mom came in and found me looking at the picture. I put it in my pocket, not wanting to remind her about Mr. Danver if I could help it. I moved on to another box, Mom taking the box of photos I'd been looking through, and I tried to put the name out of my mind. It was easy to do as I worked, but as I sat at home later, still sore from a day of moving furniture and sorting boxes, I started thinking more about it. If my parents and I knew about Mr. Danver, did anyone else? I pulled up Reddit and made the post before I could think better of it. I didn't know if you could transfer the knowledge like this, but I wanted to know bad enough to find out. Hey guys, just remembered something from when I was a kid, and I wanted to know if anyone had ever heard of it. My dad told me a spooky story about Mr. Danver when I was a kid, saying he would come get me. My mom knew about it too, but I was wondering if it was something anyone else had heard of or if it was something he made up. It had barely sat for 5 minutes before I got a response. It wasn't the last either. Yeah, my dad told me about him when I was little. Seems like I must have had nightmares about it, 'cause I can remember dreaming he was in the corner of my room sometimes. OMG, so weird. That was exactly what my mom called it too. It was weird when she told me too. I thought she was having a seizure. My uncle used to tell me that he would come get me if I was bad. Wasn't there a song or a poem that went along with it too? Yeah, it was pretty catchy, but I can't remember all the words. On and on and on. The thread had around 100 comments, and not all of them were from Americans either. Mr. Danver seemed to be something that lived in the consciousness of most English-speaking people, and even if it had a different name, the descriptions they gave were exactly the same. Tall, suited, pale, wispy hair, sharp teeth, black eyes. The description was universal, and the idea that I wasn't alone didn't make me feel any better. If you too have experienced Mr. Danver, it's already too late. One day you will tell your children. One day they will have the knowledge. One day, if they are lucky enough to avoid the icy grip of Mr. Danver, they too will pass it on. The cycle always continues, whether you want it to or not. One day I too will infect my child with the looming specter of Mr. Danver. The terrible thing. I was about 16 when it happened. It was in my friend Josh's basement, after a night trawling the streets in our small town, and spending some time in the old settlers' cemetery over by the railway. It was a path we'd walked many times. We'd been best mates since primary school, and both of us lived in the same houses we always had, about a block apart. Multiple times a week, you'd hear one of our mums calling the other one on the landline saying, "I've got the boys for dinner tonight." The whole town is like that. Really. Josh and I were both only children. It's probably why we were so close. I'd once found a box in the same basement where the terrible thing happened. It had in it some pictures of Josh's parents and a very small baby. Dust and a pink blanket cradled an impossibly small urn engraved with the name Lily. That's how I found out he had once had a little sister. But now he was alone like me. We walked alone, together, down the same track we had so many times before, past the old church and up to the cemetery. By 16, we were over lightsaber fights with fallen oak branches and pretending rocks were human remains. Usually, it was the ideal time and place to light up a joint and talk about whatever video game we were into or how he wanted to be a footballer when he grew up. But this night, there were no joints to be had on account of our regular supplier being recently apprehended by the police. This night, we just walked around and eventually sat outside the old Bork mausoleum. It was balmy, in the intersection between autumn and summer. It stayed light for a long time, and the late twilight gave us a sense of security while we sat under the weight of the large concrete stoop. "Do you ever want to leave this place?" Josh asked me. "Not until I have a reason to," I replied. We jabbered on and hung around for too long, until it came to be about 9 o'clock at night, and we figured we'd better show our faces back home before the mums went looking. Just as we were about to leave, the most rotten, repugnant smell wafted over us. Did you drop your guts, you fucking feral?" I choked out, laughing at Josh as he covered his mouth and nose with his old t-shirt. "I wish that was me. That's gotta be a world record." He chuckled back as we hurriedly stood up to abandon the cloud of vile odor. As I took my first step off the mausoleum concrete, I felt what could only be described as burning spiderwebs pass through my body. It winded and confused me as I looked around for something to explain the pain I was in. I heard someone breathe out. I couldn't tell if it was me or Josh, and as I looked to my right, where he had been a fraction of a second ago, all I saw was the suddenly darkened background of trees and headstones. I was enveloped by an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I'd just been told that everyone I loved was gone. "Josh!" I tried to yell, but it came out so quietly. It was as if the words were stolen from just in front of my lips. There was no reply. I paced around the perimeter of the small mausoleum, the dread and confusion making space for fear. He was nowhere. Then, against the purple glow of the almost summer night, I saw a silhouette, getting smaller as the shadows grew. Josh was impossibly far from where I had last seen him, 2 feet to my right. No more than 10 seconds had passed since the cobwebs shredded my nerves, and yet he was hundreds of meters ahead of me, on the railroad path to home. He was running. I leapt after him, motivated by both my will to reach him and my fear of being alone among the graves. I called after him again, louder this time, but either he didn't hear or he didn't care. What usually would have been a 10-minute walk was a 3-minute run. I spent the whole time tasting blood and trying to explain to myself how Josh had gotten so far ahead of me. As he turned the corner onto his street, I lost sight of him. I had the thought that should just go home, but I was concerned. Whatever happened to me, I thought, something worse had probably happened to him. Besides, my school bag that I needed for the following day was waiting for me in his basement, where the old TV was hooked up to his PlayStation. As I approached his house, I went straight around back to the basement door, thinking I'd go through and grab my bag, then head into the house where I assumed I'd find Josh in his bedroom or in the living area. As I gasped for breath against the humid air of the night, my hand grasped the knob of the basement door. It was unusually warm, thinking back now, but at the time, it barely registered. I pulled it open and went to step inside when there it was again. The stench of sulfur and decay emanated from the open door of the basement. Suddenly, Josh was in front of me, his pupils dilated in the dark. His face wore an unhinged look, but oddly, he didn't look like he'd just run a couple of miles. "Whoa, what was that, hey?" he blurted out. "So weird. You took a while to get back." I wanted to say a million things. Why did you run? What happened? And mostly, can you not smell that? But something held my tongue. "I need to get my bag," I said to him, gesturing in the general direction. "Oh yeah, sure." He walked backwards. He didn't turn and walk, or stand to the side. He walked backwards like he knew what was behind him without seeing. As I entered the room, the spiderwebs inside began to burn again. The nearer Josh was, the more the feeling and smell intensified. I picked up my bag and walked towards the door. "Hey, it's pretty dangerous out there. Why don't you just stay here the night?" There was nothing unusual about the way he spoke, but I sensed a menace in his words that terrified me. Something was wrong. Something was awfully wrong with how it felt. He was off, as if his aura had spoiled. I stepped out of the basement, never taking my eyes off him. I don't know how to explain it other than the essence of who was felt corrupted. "Where is Josh?" I said in a whisper. Someone standing in the basement where Josh had been could not have possibly heard. Then, in the most haunting noise, I struggled to say it was a voice because it sounded like thousands of pained screams with the volume turned down and distorted into the formation of words. It was pestilent, like it infected my body instead of being heard. "It doesn't need to know. I left that town." And a humming started. "My name is Tom Morphy. I look down upon streetlights from my foggy bathroom window every single morning. I live in a low high-rise near the sloping coastline of Pike's Place, and far enough from the West Bridge to avoid impulsive thoughts. I work from my apartment, writing short pulp fiction for a website called Albatrossic, a site which must somehow compete with video content through short blurbs of derivative, fetishistic, and painfully rushed storytelling. I write 10 500-word stories a day, likely to be read by no one besides my 2 editors, several web crawlers, and a few foreign bot accounts. Albatrossic, in the untold wisdom of its founder, dumps content onto its hundreds of pages with the pace of a dragster car, firing burnt oil in the form of stories baked at freezing temperatures in the minds of young, drunk writers. The day I humbly presented a binder of shorts and treatments to Dirk Weiler, CEO of Albatrossic, a man not noticeably older than I was the day I accepted my place as a drop in the bucket. He liked my stories. Of course he did. He liked popcorn movies and videos of people hurting themselves on trampolines. He liked whatever was in front of him. And somehow he also operated a company with investors and employees, and board meetings and conferences. Why was it that he met with every prospective writer on his own time? It seemed wildly inefficient, but another thought kicked me in the frontal for thinking in the first place. The answer was, of course, who cares? I took the job because it was a job to take, and my rent was getting too high to cover by selling plasma. This way I could write for a living and drink from the fruits of my labor as a writer. And of course, the two worked symbiotically. My apartment is a space habitable for one person only. I cannot open my home to anyone without prefacing with the fact that I live alone and live by means equal to that of my peers. I admit to outsiders that I am no different than any other writer, self-absorbed, untidy, scatterbrained, and horribly mentally ill. Though I admit this through omission and repeated mistakes rather than open communication, the right to which is reserved only for the characters in my stories. Emotional growth is a form of fiction and should not be regarded as reality. There is no cure for apathy. Of course, I'm not only a pseudo-fictionist. I am, by all positive accounts, a novelist. My first published piece, a novella titled Into the Open, told the story of a young man raised in a cult-like commune in Georgia who travels to New York in search of a new life. The story won second place in the Washington State Gregorio Billings Young Writer medium-length fiction competition, narrowly missing the prize money and any relevant recognition that could lead to publication or employment. After this reality check, I delved headfirst into writing my next work, a full-length novel that I would surely be able to sell to a publisher, if only given the opportunity. Live Immolation, my first real novel, followed a radio talk show host who was ostracized after angrily berating a listener who called in to discuss her relationship troubles. The novel was intended to be a dark comedy, though friends who read my initial draft reported that the story veered too far into the dark without enough comedy to provide levity. I distinctly remember a close friend from high school describing the work as depression porn. After some revitalization, I had a final draft that was notably more clear in terms of comedy and possibly more palatable to a general audience. I shopped the work around to several publishers, receiving no interest, before I finally settled to self-publish on e-readers and in audio form. The book received moderate success online after a small amount of debt-inducing promotion, and sold well enough for me to stock up on alcohol every couple weeks for a good half year or so. After that, I tried to cultivate my audience. I tried to write more long-form pieces, but it didn't work. My success was a flash in the pan, and it took me far too long to realize that. By the time I ended up at Albatrossic, I was a shell of myself, a shell of the envisioned rock star writer that I had dreamed about being as a teenager. I became simply just another writer for just another publication that would die when the servers went down. So I settled in and wrote my shitty little stories. Every day was the same, until last week. Last week, I took my weekly trip to the Albatrossic offices to meet with Sydney, one of my editors. Sydney wrote a fine line between manic optimism and manic anger. I never knew what I was getting into with him. I hadn't even stepped into his office, and he had already started berating me. "Tom, what's your fucking problem?" "Excuse me? You think this is funny?" He picked up a paper from his desk and started reading. I recognized it as one of my recent shorts, a sci-fi horror piece titled In Zone 20. He skimmed it while reading out loud, which annoyed me slightly. He got to a section near the end, where the main character faced the horror beyond his comprehension. And well, I don't remember how it ended, but the version he read was not what I had written. This version ended with a 500-word string of random phrases and words. It was incomprehensible. I stopped Sydney from reading further. "I didn't write that." "You submitted it last week." "No. I submitted a story, one with an ending. That isn't it." Sydney looked at me with an odd expression, like he actually believed me but couldn't find the words to express it. "Well, what the fuck is this then?" "I don't know. Someone must be messing with me." "Who would do that?" "I don't know, Sid. I'm just as confused as you are." "Well, it's not the only one." Sydney motioned for me to come over. He showed me his computer screen with the email submissions I had sent to him the week prior. All of the stories ended in the same way. Strings of random phrases and words filled the space where the conclusions had been. I stood bewildered, staring at the screen. I only printed one before I noticed it. I didn't send any to Dirk. "Thank God for that," I muttered. I considered why the editors even printed stories for review when they were to be published online. Just another pointless conceit of this shitty company. I laughed in my head, but the unease was growing. What was going on with my stories? This had to be some sick joke. "Is your email secure?" "Yeah, I've got two-factor. But even then, who would hack my email just to ruin my stories?" Sydney didn't reply. He was clearly more concerned with my output than the mysterious circumstances. "Look, I'll head home and send the stories over again." "All right. Okay. Just try to make sure this doesn't happen again." I didn't reply. I speed-walked out of the office and caught a taxi home. My brain was running, mostly out of annoyance. It did seem like Sydney believed me, but he still blamed me for whatever this was. As much as I hated this job, I couldn't afford to get canned right now. My rent had gone up, again, and I was falling further and further into my expensive alcoholic slump. I needed the money. I needed to figure this out. I got home and checked my Word files. The stories were normal. The conclusions were just as I had written them. I checked the email I had sent to Sydney next. They were the same files, without the anomalies. Every one of the stories were just as I had written them. It didn't make sense. I sent a second email with all of the stories and immediately called Sydney. "Did you get it? Tom, you have to be honest with me right now. Are you taking drugs?" "What? No. Of course not. What's the problem?" "It's the same shit, Tom. The endings are all fucked. I don't know what's going on, but I don't have time for this. Either quit fucking around, or I'm telling Dirk about your little game." He hung up the phone, and I was left dumbfounded. I checked the email again every few minutes for the next hour. I read each story several times over, expecting them to suddenly change, but they were all normal. I took another cab ride, another $20 I couldn't afford, back to the office with my laptop in hand. Sydney was not happy to see me. He was yelling and telling me to fuck off, all in front of another poor writer in for his weekly meeting. "Please, Sid, I'm fucking confused." I set my laptop on his desk and showed him the stories and the emails. We then compared them to the emails he had received. That was when we noticed it. The stories I had sent that day had different abnormalities than the ones I had sent the week prior. It was still the same mess of random words, but different words in different places. Sydney was now in the same state of confusion and perplexed interest that I was. The other writer in the room awkwardly excused himself as we continued to look over the different stories. Now, with Sydney seemingly on my side, I at least had a bit of security. Yet the unease held strong, and my head began to feel heavy. After an hour of review and confirmation, I was sent home knowing nothing more than I had before. Sydney told me he would reach out to the IT department to rule out a security breach. The company had provided my email, as well as their own internal servers for storing emails. If it was a hacker, it had to be a sophisticated one, I thought. I knew almost nothing about hacking, so I wasn't sure how probable that was. When I got home, I changed my passwords for nearly every account I had. I even covered my laptop's camera with a strip of tape. That night, to get my mind off things, I had a few drinks and sat down to write a story. It was my profession, but it was also an itch that I could never fully scratch. I had to write. It was all I could do. So I wrote a little story about a farmer who sees a UFO on his farm, but no one believes him. A simple thing. Nothing I could ever get published. But it still felt good to get it down. I woke up the next morning, hungover and tired, and opened my laptop to a string of email notifications. The first few were from Sydney and my other editor, Dawn. The next was from Dirk, that made my stomach drop. Dirk never emailed people. I had only ever spoken to him in his office. I read the emails and my stomach sank further. Apparently, last night, Sydney and Dawn had received several emails from me containing stories I hadn't written. I started reading the email from Dirk, but didn't finish it. I was certain I'd be fired over this. According to the emails I didn't remember sending, 7 short stories had been sent to Sydney and Dawn, each one more depraved than the last, and each one having no conclusion, only the scattered words and phrases. I sat and read them each with a blank expression, becoming more and more concerned over what was happening. I joined a conference call with Dirk and Sydney and attempted to explain myself. Dirk was more sympathetic than I expected, though I could tell he thought I must be going through some psychotic episode. He recommended that I take some time off, unpaid of course, and check into a hospital if things did not improve. Sydney was reluctant to comment. He didn't mention the previous day or the proof I had shown him. Fucking asshole. Without him acting as witness, I must have seemed like a lunatic attempting to explain how some unknown force was influencing my emails. I even asked Sydney if he had heard from it about a security breach, but he told me that they reported no unusual activity or breaches, and the emails had been sent from my IP address. That night, as I laid in bed wallowing, I began to hear a noise. A humming. At first I thought it was traffic, but it persisted and grew slightly in volume with every passing minute. I began searching the apartment for defective electronics, light bulbs, anything that could have been making the noise. I found no source for the humming. It seemed to emanate from wherever I was not. I drank some, more than enough to forget about the emails, but the humming continued to grow louder. I woke up the next morning feeling dead. I didn't open my laptop. Instead, I started drinking. I was halfway through a day of television and bourbon, and that fucking humming when my phone rang. It was Sydney. Look, man, I don't know what's going on with you. We don't know each other well, but honestly, I'm getting worried. We're gonna have to block your email if you keep doing this. What am I doing? I haven't touched my fucking computer since yesterday. I slurred, trying to hide it. Are you drunk? Yes, I'm drunk. That doesn't mean I sent any fucking emails. Get it together, Tom. The shit you're sending me is fucked up. Where did you get those photos? I can't find them anywhere online. What photos? Look, if you're gonna play dumb, that's fine, but you're not gonna keep your job much longer if you keep this up. This is a major HR violation. Fuck you, a show. The line cut out. I opened my laptop in a haze and navigated to my email. I took another sip of my drink and prepared myself for what I was about to see. It was the same shit. Stories I hadn't written with nonsense endings. Disturbing stories about human experiments and a being called the Effer. Honestly, the stories were captivating and quite well written, but they were too depraved and far too gory for any publisher. I considered for a moment, for the first time, that I might have been writing these stories while blackout drunk, but the writing wasn't my style. It was simplistic and raw. I usually preferred more defined language, I knew that. It wasn't my writing. I was almost sure of it, but the doubt was fucking with me. As I read further through the stories, I saw the photos, placed throughout the stories, at the end of paragraphs and between sentences, were hyperlinks to image files. The first image, in grainy black and white, showed a man sitting in a chair with a bag over his head. There were wires connected to his hands and forehead with small prongs. The image was labeled as Interval Testing 004, Sept. 1993. There were more images like this, most of them showing similar scenes of people in chairs with wires connected to them, all labeled in the same way. One of the later images showed a figure obscured by darkness. They held their hands at their ears, and their mouth seemed to open wider than should have been possible. That one made me feel strange. I didn't want to look at it too long. I downed another drink and continued looking through the images. One of the last ones showed a group of figures in the foreground, just nearly outside of the frame. They wore lab coats and eye protection, and they stared in awe at the figure in the center of the frame. The figure was that of a small child suspended in mid-air with their limbs outstretched. It seemed as if the child was being pulled in all directions by an unseen force. I couldn't see any ropes or wires in the image. It appeared that the child was floating, an unclear expression of joy on their face amidst the noise of the low-quality image. I felt sick. I closed the laptop and paced around the room. There was no way I could explain this to anyone without coming off like a psychopath. The images had no origin, as Sydney had said, and they had been sent from my email address. I was responsible for this mess of which I had no understanding. My fear was growing, and with it the humming grew too. I sat down at my desk that night, after coffee and a cold shower, sober as I could be, and drafted a letter to Dirk. I couldn't risk writing an email, and attempted to explain my situation from my perspective. I hoped he would have a shred of empathy, enough to believe me. I had never caused any problems for the company. I had done my work for the past year without issue, and had been commended for it on numerous occasions. I was an award runner-up and a published author. I felt that I was of enough value to the company, at least for him to hear me out. I took a cab to the office, yet again, and dropped my letter in the box. When I got back to my apartment, the humming seemed louder than ever. I had trouble sleeping. There was another sound now that accompanied the low humming, a shrill tone of static, quiet but persistently growing. I awoke again to the humming. I refrained from drinking all morning, downing coffee by the pitcher instead of bourbon. I checked my email and found a reply from Dirk. The email informed me that my contract was to be terminated immediately, and I would receive no severance due to numerous HR violations. I was livid. I walked to the office in a blitz of anger, chain-smoking cigarettes and trying to form my argument. The walk was long enough that I felt I had a good grip on what I would say to Dirk. I arrived at the office, snuffed out my cigarette, and made my way past the receptionist. On the way up, I received several odd stares from my former coworkers. I was nearly at Dirk's door when a security guard grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me away. I fought back and was able to pull away from the man. I burst into Dirk's office with the guard on my tail and started pleading. As the guard pulled me away, I screamed that I was scared, that I didn't know what was happening, and that I deserved my position at the company. The police were waiting for me outside. They took me to the station and locked me in a cell. I was told shortly after that the company was not going to press charges, but that I would still be held there for the night on account of my outburst. It was there, laying in that cell cot, that the humming returned louder than ever. And now there was something beyond the dull tone and shrill creaks, a voice that crackled and scratched like radio static. It was quiet at first, and I couldn't make out the words. But as my restless night continued, I began to hear the aphorisms it repeated, and my world suddenly became clearer. Sing, stay, breathe, make, truth, lift, take, immolate, synthesize. It repeated these words over and over, and as the voice grew louder, the meaning began to resonate. I felt warmth inside, something like a whiskey burn, but ever more euphoric. I felt true. I felt myself. I felt inspired. Sing, stay, breathe, make, truth, lift, take, immolate, synthesize. The words that only some had heard. They had heard it, yes. Those who took the photos, they were looking for it. Trying to induce it, it must have been. Late that night, in the cell, I began to levitate. No one saw, of course. The guard that had been watching had gone. I was alone, yet I was not. The effer was there to show me its truth. I rose from my bed, and the levity grew within me like a panacea to the disease I had felt for so long. I levitated there for some time, weightless and formless. I felt my body turn to winding wires, and felt fear for only a second. It was quickly hushed by the effer. It repeated new aphorisms to me, revealing further truths. Here, now, truth, be it, feel, dissent, revelation, seek, reform. And I did. My body reformed, and I found myself within a conscious sleep. For some time, I wandered this space without reason. I saw nothing. I felt nothing. A long time like this, amidst eternity. I saw fiction. I saw vast spaces, worlds beyond this one. Then, within a split second, I awoke in that jail cell. I was smiling. I went home. I felt like a being of pure light. I had one goal, motivated internally by the effer, which had filled my being with purpose and reason. I ignored the trivial things, the alcohol in my fridge, the concerned emails, the weights that once plagued me. I became true. And now, you must become true. The humming grows louder every day. The beauty of it consumes me like a symphony on repeat. Each time it plays, I learn more of myself and of the truth I must spread. The composition is true. It is resolute, and I will act as a conduit. I am of sound mind and body, and only now can I see that. I am a vessel for the effer. It has taken my compulsion. It has taken my self-doubt. It has taken my weakness. I am a vessel, and I will spread the panacea for the poison. I hope only that these words have fueled you as well. That your inspiration is strong enough that you may be susceptible to the great panacea. The effer calls to you now. Embrace it. Please, I beg you. Find truth. Seek. Be. Help. You. See. Wash. Bleed. Seek. Reform. Write. Find. Truth. Seek. Will. Be. Help. See. Wash. Bleed. Hear. Seek. Reform. Write. Find. Truth. Seek. Be. More. Help. See. Wash. Bleed. Seek. Reform. Write. Find. Truth. Seek. Be. Help. See. Wash. Bleed. Seek. Reform. Write. Soon. The laboratory in the mountain. It was in the winter of 2023, February to be exact, that something very unexpected happened to me and my father. As we got out of the rented car, my dad asked me, "Ready for the tracks?" I replied, "Of course." Little did I know that I was ready for the tracks, but not ready for what was about to happen. We started walking towards the seated ski lift. We entered the enclosure of the station for the lift, and as the seat slowly veered towards us, we sat down. I asked my dad, "Which path are we gonna ride on?" My dad thinks for a few solid seconds, and then answers, "Let's go off-slope." I hesitate for a second. Flashbacks in my mind reminding me of what off-slope felt like back in Switzerland, and then agree with my dad. Yeah, let's go off-slope. Why not? We got off the lift and started thinking, should we start here or go even further up? We decided to go even further up. Actually, the furthest up we could go. It was that decision, the decision to go to the top of the mountain, that proved terribly wrong. We reached the highest point you can go to by lift. I put down my skis. My dad put down his snowboard, and we checked if everything was in our backpacks. We brought a metallic thermos with tea, some cookies, flashlights just in case, a few hand warmers, and a navigator, also just in case. I put the navigator in my left side pocket because we both had small backpacks and it didn't fit in them. "Looks like we are ready to go," said my dad. I nodded. I strapped into my skis, and my dad strapped on his snowboard. We took off, down the mountain, and we reached a pretty high speed quite quickly, maybe 30 or 40 kilometers per hour, I'd say. I wanted to go in front of my dad, and I carefully overtook him. I turned around to give him a thumbs up, turned back around to face forward. And in 1 second, I was riding through the deep snow. In the next, I was flying downwards. Everything seemed to slow down at that moment. I looked downwards, and in my seconds of flight saw something interesting. The snow had fallen downwards, taking me with it. At first, I collided with the hard, snowy ground with my left side, but then my head caught up, and everything went black. The first thing I saw after hitting the ground was my dad's face, as he was trying to shake me awake. I mumbled something incomprehensible, and as I started to wake, I became aware that the navigator we brought had been crushed by the fall. "Oh no," I thought to myself. As I got up, I noticed that my skis and my dad's snowboard had been snapped by the fall, and that we were in some kind of cavity. As I looked up, I saw the huge height we had fallen off. A menacing question started creeping into my mind. How are we going to get out? The sides of the hole we had fallen into were very smooth, and there was no way we could climb up them. My dad came up to me and started explaining what he saw when I started falling. "I was riding right behind you, and when I saw how you quickly fell down the hole, I tried to stop, but I was too fast and fell in right behind you. I didn't want to land on you, so I jumped forward a bit and landed first on my board at an angle, so it snapped under all of the weight, and I landed on my butt. As we together thought of a way out, my dad decided to knock on all sides of the supposed cave we fell into. All the knocks were the same, until one of them sounded very hollow. It was a sheet of ice on the wall, and the first idea that came to mind of what to do was to kick the ice down. The sheet cracked on the second kick and completely shattered on the fifth. As I looked inside, I saw something out of place. Metal structures. We were looking inside a room of some sort. The walls were white concrete, and there were some kind of metallic machines. We walked in, confused and a little creeped out. Why and when was this built? I thought to myself, was this maybe some secret laboratory? It was eerily silent, except for the occasional dripping of water. As we walked further through the structure, the scent of mildew and dust hit our noses, and we started seeing other metallic machines with many different kinds of claws and hooks. It all looked very unsettling now. The light from the hole was fading steadily, and at some point, we had to pull out our flashlights when it got too dark for us to see properly. We were maybe 10 or so minutes in, is when we heard the first sound except for water droplets since we first entered the laboratory. It was the ever so faint sound of what appeared to be footsteps of some kind. I gave the signal to my father to turn off our flashlights and wait. Everything went silent for a few moments. The steps resumed after the 5 seconds that felt like hours because of the fear that somebody was there with us. We got the chance to listen to the footsteps closely, and they sounded off. They were offbeat and very slow. They didn't sound human. Whatever it was far away, and there was no way it hurt us, so we were relatively safe, for now. As we headed further in, I took my time to look at the equipment scattered across the rotting tables, forgotten, and seemingly hadn't been touched for 80 years. That theory proved correct when I saw a date on one of the crates which was used to transport the equipment, the crate being used in 1943. The date didn't surprise me all that much, since it all looked as old as it indicated. My dad walked over and said 1943. That's World War II era. Austria was occupied by Nazi Germany back then. What use did they have for this lab in 1943? Nuclear or bioweapons development? As I looked around the room, trying to spot any hints that may give away the purpose of the underground facility. My eyes stopped on many reddish-brown stains scattered across the floor and walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coffee accident and not what it looked like. I decided to follow the stain trail and called out to my dad to do the same. I found out where the trail led, only a 10-second walk through the rooms to find the trail start. It was a glass chamber of some sort. It has a toilet, sink, and a bed. The bed was also stained with that putrid color of brownish red. There was a spot on the glass wall where the glass was broken, and it seemed that someone, or something, had broken out of the chamber rather than in, since most of the glass shards were laying outside the enclosure. And at that moment I knew what this lab was for. It was for experimenting on people. Since this all happened during World War II, it is a solid guess that they were experimenting on prisoners. As I was looking around the horror-inducing chamber, when I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were louder and way faster. I realized they were getting louder and louder each second. It was heading toward us. I signaled my dad to keep very quiet. I didn't notice that my flashlight was still on, but it was already too late to turn it off. The beam of light was pointing directly at the thing that had been walking around the lab this whole time. I was dead silent as I turned my head to gaze at the creature, and was horrified. It was disturbingly humanoid, except its skin had turned a grayish tone, and its eyes were missing. It was blind. That's it, that's why it didn't see the beam of light. This meant that if we were very silent, then we could sneak past it and into another room. We were very lucky to find a room with doors that had working locks, and we sneaked inside, and as silently as we could, closed the doors and locked the locks. We sat down on the floor, tired of the mix of adrenaline and fear. I decided to drink some tea and eat a little bit. I opened my backpack and realized that I hadn't closed the thermos tightly enough, and it had leaked tea into my backpack, but the amount leaked was small. I drank the tea and ate a cookie. I finished drinking. I put the thermos on the floor. My dad gave me a hand warmer, and we started deciding which way we should go. We only had two choices since there were only two doors in the room. One led back to where we came from, and the other led to the other part of the laboratory. Well, we aren't going back to whatever the hell that thing was. My dad reasoned. Well, then the obvious choice is the door that leads further into the lab. I started putting my things back into my backpack when, to my horror, the thermos I had brought with me slipped out of my hand because it was wet from the leak earlier. A loud bang sounded in all directions. I quickly picked the thermos up. The steps started again, the loudest yet. We quickly exchanged glances with my dad and sprinted as silently as we could out of the room. As we ran away and closed the doors behind us, I could hear a menacing banging on the door we closed. Then we heard a horrifying crack as the locked door seemingly was bashed in by the creature. How strong is it? I thought to myself in terror. We sped up our sprint as we heard a banging yet again, this time on the other door we closed while we ran. We ran even further when I noticed something different in the structure of the lab. It was a staircase. I signaled my dad to go up the stairs, and we started ascending. Even though we only went up 3 stories, it felt like a lot more. As we reached the 3 stories, we noticed that the stairs end there. We ran towards what hopefully was the exit of this wretched place. There was a ladder, and with no hesitation, I and my dad quickly climbed up. My dad went first, so if there was a locked pothole, he could bash it open. And bash it open he did when we realized that it had corroded to the ground, so we needed a lot of force to open it. I hope the creature can't climb ladders, I thought, while the footsteps grew ever louder. With a final thud to the rusted metal cover, it flew open. We hurried outside with unimaginable speed. As we got out, we noticed there was a lock on the outer side of the cover. What would have happened to us if it was closed? It's best that we'll never know. With the same unimaginable speed, we threw the cover back on the lab entrance and locked it. My dad proposed the idea that we put a boulder on the cover so that the creature will have no way to get out. We can only hope that it is not strong enough to break through. My dad said, I was too tired to respond. I just nodded. The adrenaline had started to wear off, and before I knew it, I collapsed into the snow. My dad lay down beside me, and we lay there for a while. After we got a little strength back from our rest, we started a mix of climbing and sliding down the mountain. We had ended up on the peak of the mountain after we climbed out, and there was a pretty long way down. As soon as we reached the first track, we waved for people to slow down. One person stopped to help us, and we asked them to call a helpline. We told him to call a snowmobile, and it arrived after about 15 minutes. We were happy that the person on the snowmobile didn't ask anything and just drove us straight to the hospital. We were let out of the hospital the same day because we only had minor bruises. When we arrived home that day, I just went straight to my bed and collapsed into sleep. The next few days were spent mostly trying to find any information about a laboratory in the Austrian mountains, and found nothing except on the 5th day of research, when I was ready to give up. I found a website with what appeared to be info on the lab. It was some kind of website, and the first thing I saw when I went to see it was the big message, "Not secure." I didn't hesitate even for 1 second. I immediately clicked on the button, "Proceed to the website." The website looked sketchy as hell, but I was very desperate for information. I read the text, and it said this: the laboratory of was built in the Austrian Alps in the year 1940, and it was used to experiment on humans. The laboratory had been known to infect people with several parasites and viruses, but it was quickly abandoned in May of 1945. The most probable cause of its abandonment is the end of World War II, but it is not certain. The laboratory has not been found. Even to this day, its location is unknown. I didn't know what to think of this. I accepted this as truth because of what I've seen. I went to bed and didn't think of the incident much until one day. To be continued. The last call. A bartender's tale. I have been a bartender for a good part of my adult life, serving drinks to all kinds of people from all walks of life, hearing their stories, some jovial, some melancholic, and some outright eerie. The bar, a dimly lit sanctuary tucked in an obscure alley downtown, was the stage, and its patrons, the performers of these nightly dramas. Its cracked leather stools, weathered pool table, and the old jukebox in the corner were all part of its character. In this microcosm of human existence, life unfolded every night with the pouring of the first pint, culminating with the last call. One particular winter night, the wind howled outside, frigid and unforgiving, as I started my shift. Only a handful of regulars were huddled inside, savoring the warmth of the bar and their drinks. Around midnight, just as the clock chimed the hour, a stranger walked in. He was a haggard man with weary eyes and a face that bore the weight of the world. His clothes were disheveled, and his hands, rough with calluses, clenched onto a worn-out hat. Something about his aura whispered eeriness, but as a bartender, I was accustomed to peculiarities. He sat at the farthest end of the bar, ordered a whiskey neat, and began to sip it slowly. The hum of casual chatter and clinking glasses filled the air as the stranger stared blankly into his glass. After a few drinks, he finally broke his silence and began to narrate a story that would forever haunt the annals of my bartending days. "The name's Earl," he started, his voice husky and laden with an uncanny calmness. His eyes were fixated on the golden liquid swirling in his glass, as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I used to work at the shipyard, right here in this city." His story started innocently, recounting his younger days working in the shipyard, the long hours, the tough manual labor, and the camaraderie among the workers. But as the night wore on, his tale took a sinister turn. It was a story filled with spectral ships, haunted seas, and cursed sailors, told with such a vivid and chilling realism that it sent shivers down even the most hardened spine. As Earl's words painted the macabre picture, the bar's ambient noise seemed to dissipate. The regulars, previously engrossed in their drinks and conversations, gradually fell silent, their attention lured by the grim tale. Even the jukebox appeared to lower its merry tune in respect to the unfolding horror. Earl described a ship, the Mariner's Sorrow, that had mysteriously disappeared many years ago during a treacherous storm. He claimed to be the sole survivor, haunted ever since by the souls of his drowned comrades. Every detail of his experience, from the cold, salty spray of the sea to the terrified cries of the crew, was narrated with a haunting intensity. As the night crept on, the tale grew darker. The story, narrated by the dim bar light, created shadows that danced and flickered, giving the impression of ghostly sailors filling the room, their spectral eyes fixated on their living comrade narrating their tale. As I write this part of the story, the tale is just beginning. Little did we know then, but Earl's entrance into the bar that night marked the start of a series of chilling tales that would turn our humdrum lives into a living nightmare. As Earl spoke, time seemed to halt in the dimly lit bar. The world outside disappeared, swallowed by the storm that raged in his tale. His voice, raspy from age and whiskey, carried the salt of the sea and the chilling wind of the storm. The waves were monstrous that night, Earl continued, as if angered by some unholy act. Our ship danced like a toy in their mighty hands. We fought, oh how we fought, but the sea was relentless. He paused, taking a long swig of his whiskey, his gaze lost somewhere in the array of liquor bottles behind the counter. They say you can hear it. He finally broke his silence. The song of the drowned, a mournful hymn carried by the wind. An uneasy silence fell over the bar. The patrons, a mix of everyday workers and weary travelers, were caught in the strange man's narrative, their drinks untouched, their conversations forgotten. All eyes were on Earl, the spectral light of the bar dancing in his weathered features. Can you imagine it? 100 voices silenced by the sea, their last breaths a symphony of bubbles racing towards the surface. Yet their song continues, a chilling reminder of the sea's treachery. His words sent a chill down our spines, the horrifying reality of his story dawning on us. Earl's tale wasn't just a recounting of a tragic event. It was an unveiling of a supernatural world that lurked beneath the surface of our own. And then there was the captain, Captain Barnaby. Earl continued, a shadow crossing his face. A man more at home in the salty spray of the sea than on solid ground. A man whose fate was entwined with the Mariner's Sorrow. His words hung in the air, painting a vivid image of the doomed ship and its unfortunate crew. In our minds, we could see the figure of Captain Barnaby at the helm, bracing himself against the violent sea, his eyes holding an eerie calmness. The tale took a turn then. Earl began to recount his encounters with the spectral Captain Barnaby after the shipwreck. As he described his sightings of the ghostly figure at the shipyard and his haunted dreams where he found himself back on the storm-tossed ship, it was clear that the tragedy of the Mariner's Sorrow was far from over. The night drew on, and Earl's story unfolded like a nightmare before us. Each revelation was more terrifying than the last, the chilling details creeping into the quiet corners of the bar, looming in the shadows. As the final call for drinks echoed through the bar, Earl's tale reached a crescendo. His eyes, wide and fearful, scanned the silent faces around him. "And now I know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not alone. They're here, Captain Barnaby, the crew, they've followed me." A collective shiver ran through us. Outside, the wind howled, as if echoing the sorrowful song of the drowned sailors. The tale was far from over, and we could only wait, entranced and horrified, as Earl took another swig of his whiskey, steeling himself for the continuation of his tale. Earl's gripping tale had already set our nerves on edge when he lifted his glass to his lips, pausing, looking right through the amber liquid as if he could see the faces of his fallen crewmates reflected in it. Then he drank, finishing the whiskey in one swift gulp, and slammed the glass back onto the bar top. The sound echoed through the quiet room. The bar, usually filled with boisterous laughter and drunken shenanigans, was silent except for the soft hum of the neon lights and the occasional clink of a glass. But that's not the end. "My friends," Earl said, his voice low but audible. He leaned in closer, and we found ourselves leaning in as well, drawn in by the gravity of his story. That's just the beginning. He then began to recount the many encounters he'd had with the ghosts of his past, both on land and at sea. From spectral figures at the foot of his bed, ethereal shadows in the corner of his eyes, to ghostly whispers carried by the sea breeze, each encounter sent fresh chills down our spines. "The captain, he would show up in the most unexpected places," Earl continued. "In my dreams, yes, but also in the reflection of shop windows, in the waves crashing on the shore, in the faces of strangers. Always watching, always waiting." He went on to tell us about a particularly horrifying incident when he'd woken up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and found himself back on the doomed ship. The sheets around him felt like salty seawater, and he could hear the ominous creaking of the ship and the roaring sea. "I tried to scream, to move, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I were tied to the mast, forced to watch as my crew was swallowed by the sea, one by one," he said, his voice shaking with remembered fear. "And then I saw him, Captain Barnaby, standing at the helm, steering us into the heart of the storm." The room was deadly quiet. Earl's words hung in the air, their echo resonating in our minds. The horrifying reality of his experiences seeped into the atmosphere, transforming the familiar surroundings of the bar into an eerie stage for his narrative. He talked about how, in the following days, he tried to escape his ghostly pursuers. He moved to another town, tried to start a new life, but they followed him, their mournful song a constant reminder of his haunted past. "But you can't run from your past," Earl said, locking eyes with me. His gaze was intense, the weight of his words sinking deep into my bones. "And you can't escape your ghosts." There was something in the way he said it, a fatalistic acceptance laced with an undercurrent of fear that made my heart pound in my chest. His tale wasn't just a horrifying recount of a supernatural occurrence. It was a chilling testimony of a man being slowly consumed by his past, haunted by specters of guilt and loss. With that, Earl pushed back his chair, stood up, and walked out of the bar, leaving behind a room full of shell-shocked patrons and a tale that would haunt our dreams for nights to come. After Earl's chilling departure, the bar remained silent for a long moment. The clink of his empty glass still echoed in my ears, and I found myself staring at the door he had just exited, half expecting him to come back in, perhaps with a laugh, to tell us it was all a joke. But the door remained closed, and the laugh never came. Unnerved, the patrons began to peel away from the hush, leaving their unfinished drinks behind, whispering hurried goodbyes. Only a few of us remained, each lost in our thoughts, wrestling with the spectral shadows Earl's tale had cast. I stayed behind, slowly sipping the remains of my whiskey, the taste suddenly bitter. The low hum of the neon sign was the only sound filling the void Earl had left. My gaze fell on the glass he had left behind. The single remaining ice cube was gradually melting away, mirroring the way his story had slowly infiltrated our peace of mind, leaving us disturbed and anxious. The following night, a regular named Marian took the vacant seat at the bar, her usually vibrant eyes now clouded with an eerie seriousness. "I heard Earl's story," she began, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her glass. "And I've got a tale of my own. Maybe if I tell it, it won't feel so real anymore." We listened as Marianne unfolded her tale about a cruel twist of fate that led her to cross paths with a cursed painting. A painting rumored to bring death to anyone who dared to claim it. Despite the warnings, her curiosity had prevailed, leading her to witness nightmarish visions that forced her to question reality itself. "The painting, it comes alive at night," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The woman in the portrait. I've seen her. In my house, in my dreams. She watches me, her eyes filled with such sorrow and despair that it chills my blood." Night after night, as the clock struck midnight, we heard different tales from various patrons, stories that hid in the shadows of their daily lives, emerging only in the somber serenity of our little establishment. The supernatural entangled with the ordinary, blurring the lines between reality and the unfathomable. Every tale was a window into their lives, each a chilling tapestry of fear and the unknown. It became an unspoken tradition, a pact of sorts. The tales would circulate, shared in hushed whispers, morphing and adapting, but always retaining their kernel of horror that made our hearts pound and the hair on the back of our necks stand on end. I came to realize that the bar was more than just a place to drink and unwind. It was a vessel carrying these tales, a harbor for the stories too terrifying to tell in the light of day. And I, the bartender, was no longer just a server of drinks, but a custodian of their fears, a keeper of their most haunting realities. Each tale was a drop in an ocean of dread, making our quiet bar a reservoir of terror and mystery. The patrons, previously seen as just ordinary people, were now authors of chilling anecdotes, ones that left even the bravest among us shaken to our core. One night, a stoic truck driver, known as Big Tom, added his contribution. He'd been working late shifts for as long as he could remember, hauling goods along deserted highways under the lonely moonlight. It was on one such night, he recalled, while traversing a notoriously deserted stretch of Route 66, that he had his unsettling encounter. There was a woman, he began, dressed all in white, standing on the side of the road, thumb out for a ride. This was in the middle of nowhere, mind you, not a soul or town in sight for miles. I figured she was in trouble, so I stopped. The woman, he explained, was peculiarly out of place. Dressed in what seemed like a wedding gown, she didn't speak a word during the drive, only pointed straight ahead when asked where she needed to go. But when Big Tom glanced back into the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. The backseat was empty. No trace of the woman, only the chilling echo of her presence. I tell ya, I've never driven so fast in my life, he confessed, downing his shot of whiskey in one gulp. I don't know who she was or where she went, but I reckon she's still out there, thumb out, waiting for the next driver. As the month wore on, I came to look forward to the midnight hour. The tales, as terrifying as they were, brought a strange, captivating aura to the otherwise mundane routine of my life. The bar had become an asylum for the eerie and unexplainable, the patrons' stories intertwining with the very essence of the establishment. Yet there was always an unspoken understanding that as unnerving as our tales were, they were just that, tales. However, as October drew near, the atmosphere began to shift. The stories grew darker, more personal, and the line between fiction and reality began to blur. It was as if the approaching Halloween was casting a long, unsettling shadow, one that seeped into our tales, morphing them into chilling fragments of our darkest fears. The bar, once a sanctuary from the outside world, now felt different. A sense of unease was creeping in, the once comfortable silence now heavy with anticipation. As the last day of October approached, the patrons seemed more withdrawn, glancing anxiously at the clock as midnight approached. Little did we know that our tradition was about to take an unforeseen turn, a twist that would make us question the tales we had so fearlessly shared, making us wonder if they were mere tales after all. Halloween night was upon us, but there was an eerie silence that replaced the once vibrant chatter of the bar. The patrons, who previously reveled in the thrill of their chilling tales, were now huddled in their corners, nursing their drinks in silence. The air was heavy with apprehension, every tick of the clock echoing through the bar like a foreboding drumbeat. As the hands of the clock inched towards midnight, a gust of wind blew open the doors. A stranger walked in, a man none of us had seen before, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of an old battered hat. There was something immediately unsettling about him. His presence seemed to drain the little cheer that was left in the bar. Ignoring our silent stares, he took a seat at the bar and ordered a bourbon on the rocks. As I prepared his drink, I couldn't help but study him. Despite his nondescript appearance, there was an air of menace around him, a palpable feeling that sent chills down my spine. I set the drink before him, noticing that his fingers, though rough and calloused, were disturbingly cold to the touch. He acknowledged the drink with a nod. Then, as if sensing our unease, turned to the room and began to tell a tale that was unlike anything we heard before. The story was about our town, a tale of an ancient curse that befell those who dared to speak of their darkest fears. It started with the founder of this very town, a man who believed that speaking fears out loud would banish them. The stranger began, his voice low and steady. But he was wrong. By doing so, he awoke an ancient entity that fed on these fears. Every Halloween night, the entity would claim one soul, the one who dared to voice his fear the loudest. The room was filled with terrified silence, the horrifying implications of his words sinking in. Could the entity have heard our tales, the fears that we've spoken of? And more importantly, who among us voiced their fear the loudest? I thought back to all the stories we had shared, trying to remember whose tale had seemed the most genuine, the most fearful. The anxiety was contagious, spreading through the room like wildfire. The patrons looked at each other in fear, the same horrifying realization reflected in their eyes. As the room descended into panic, the stranger stood, his story complete. Leaving a few coins on the bar, he tipped his hat to us and walked out into the cold Halloween night, leaving us in the terrifying wake of his tale. As midnight approached, we waited in dreadful anticipation, unsure if the tale was true or merely the work of a twisted mind. But as the clock struck 12, we realized that our tradition of sharing scary stories might have invited a terror far more real than we had ever imagined. As midnight passed, silence reigned in the bar. Everyone was lost in their thoughts, grappling with the tale the stranger had spun. Could we really be victims of an ancient curse? The idea seemed absurd, but the fear that gripped each of us was real, the terror palpable. I found myself looking around the room, sizing up each patron, wondering who the entity would claim as its victim. It was a morbid thought, but one I couldn't shake off. Overwhelmed by the tense atmosphere, I decided to step outside, if only to escape the oppressive silence. The chill air was refreshing against my skin, the quiet streets a welcome distraction. But as I turned the corner of the bar, I froze in my tracks. There, in the dim glow of the streetlight, stood the stranger. His back was turned towards me, his tall silhouette cast a long shadow down the alleyway. He seemed to be muttering something, his body slightly swaying in an odd rhythm. A cold dread washed over me, the sense of danger instinctive. Should I confront him, or turn back and pretend I saw nothing? Before I could decide, he abruptly stopped, turning around as if sensing my presence. The wide brim of his hat cast a shadow over his face, leaving his features in darkness. But I didn't need to see his face to feel the intense gaze he pinned on me. "It's almost time," he said, his voice echoing ominously in the deserted alleyway. Then, just as abruptly as he turned, he walked away, disappearing into the dark. With my heart pounding in my chest, I went back inside the bar. The patrons were still sitting in silence, their unease mirrored on their faces. Looking at them, I felt a pang of regret. What had started as a fun tradition had spiraled into a terrifying ordeal. But the night was not over yet, and the entity, if it did exist, had yet to claim a soul. As I looked around the room, I wondered, not for the first time, who it would be. And as the clock ticked away the minutes, I found myself praying that the stranger's tale was just that, a tale spun to scare us, nothing more. As the hours passed, we all remained prisoners of our own thoughts. The whispers of fear, uncertainty, and doubt were as potent as any alcoholic concoction served at the bar. None of us knew how or when it would happen. The entity was an unknown variable, an unseen terror that had successfully insinuated itself into our collective consciousness. It was around 3 a.m. when the first incident occurred. One of the regulars, a boisterous man named Ted, who always insisted on closing out the bar, stood to leave. Ted, not known for his sobriety, had been oddly quiet. his usual bluster subdued after the stranger's tale. As he started towards the door, we all watched, waiting for something to happen, holding our breaths. Ted reached the exit, and just as he was about to step out, he froze. For a moment, it seemed like he was stuck in place, his body rigid as a statue. Then his knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. A gasp echoed through the bar as we rushed towards him. He was pale, his body trembling as he looked up at us with wide, terrified eyes. He had seen something, or someone, just outside the door, he stuttered out. He couldn't describe it. His words were a mix of garbled sentences and panicked mumbles. But the sheer terror in his eyes was enough to convince us. The entity had made its move. Fear ran rampant in the bar after that. The tense silence that had gripped us was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of our situation. Ted's incident gave credibility to the stranger's tale. It was no longer just a chilling story, but a threat that loomed over us all. I decided to lock the bar, a futile effort to keep out an entity that could move through walls, but it brought a minuscule measure of relief. As dawn approached, we huddled in the bar, our spirits a stark contrast to the rising sun outside. The joviality, camaraderie, and warmth the place had always fostered were replaced by cold dread. We were not just patrons and a bartender anymore, but a group of terrified people waiting for the unknown. The bar had always been a place of sanctuary for me. Even on the busiest of nights, when I was mixing cocktails as fast as my hands could go, there was a sense of serenity amidst the chaos. Now, as I looked out over the group of frightened people gathered in my bar, I realized that sanctity was gone. The safe, comforting world we'd known was turned inside out, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The hours wore on. We tended to Ted as best we could, his fear-laden gaze rarely leaving the front door. His encounter with the entity, whatever it may have been, had left him trembling, his usual bravado nowhere in sight. The experience had rattled him to the core, leaving us with the unshakable sense of our impending doom. By mid-morning, as sunlight streamed through the cracks in the blinds, a collective decision was made. We needed to do something. Sitting around, waiting for the entity to strike again, wasn't an option. The decision gave us a sense of purpose amidst the fear. We began searching the bar for anything that could provide answers or protection. Holy symbols, salt, iron, anything we'd heard in stories could ward off spirits. The search didn't yield much of value, but the activity provided a welcome distraction. As we scoured the bar, sharing whispered stories and speculations, there was almost a semblance of normalcy. But every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, sent us spiraling back into fear. Late into the afternoon, as we were pondering our next move, the phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence. Everyone in the room jumped, the shrill sound grating against our frazzled nerves. I stared at the phone for a moment, the number unfamiliar. Swallowing down a lump of trepidation, I picked up. The voice on the other end of the line was a raspy, wheezing echo of the stranger's. The fear that washed over me was immediate and paralyzing. It was him. He spoke just 3 words before hanging up. 3 words that sent chills down my spine. "I'm coming back." I relayed the stranger's message to the group, and their reaction was instantaneous. Faces paled, eyes widened, and the tense atmosphere intensified. The idea of the stranger returning, possibly bringing that entity with him, was more terrifying than we cared to admit. We had been thrust into a situation none of us were equipped to handle. We were ordinary people, for crying out loud, not ghost hunters or exorcists. While fear ran rampant among us, there was also a spark of defiance. We weren't going down without a fight. Some started to barricade the front door and windows. Others, including myself, resumed the search for any item that could be utilized as a weapon. Pool cues were broken to create sharp edges, and bottles were filled with anything flammable. It was a poor excuse for an arsenal, but it was all we had. Night fell once again, shrouding the world outside in darkness. Ted had regained some color, but was still quiet, sitting in a corner and staring blankly into space. We lit candles around the bar, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. It felt like we were in a haunted castle, waiting for the spectral lord to arrive. The stranger's words echoed in my mind, each repetition making me feel more on edge. "I'm coming back." It was a promise, a threat, a specter that loomed over us. Every passing minute felt like an hour as we waited, wondering when he'd fulfill his vow. Hours crawled by with no sign of the stranger or the entity. We were on high alert, jumping at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. It was an exercise in enduring psychological torment. We began to question if the stranger was toying with us, deriving some twisted pleasure from our fear. Or maybe, I thought, the real horror was not knowing. It was the anticipation, the dread of what was to come. That was the stranger's true weapon. As I watched my patrons, my friends, try to brace themselves for the unknown, I made a silent vow. I would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant going head-to-head with the entity itself. Little did I know that my vow would be put to the test sooner than expected. The deafening silence was suddenly shattered by a chilling sound echoing from outside. It was a low, guttural growl, inhuman, and filled with malice. We froze, eyes wide with terror, the chilling sound cutting through the air like a razor-sharp knife. It was the entity. It was here. That's when we saw him. The stranger stood outside the glass door, smiling a wicked smile. His eyes, filled with a menacing light, seemed to pierce through the darkness and stared directly into mine. He gave a chilling laugh, then walked out of sight, the sinister growl following him. The bar was silent. No one moved. No one breathed. It felt like we were in a nightmare, the kind you can't wake up from. The next few moments were a blur. Everyone rushed to secure the bar doors, wedging chairs, tables, anything they could find against it. We were trapped. Our sanctuary had become our prison. As the minutes turned into hours, the situation grew more dire. The entity prowled around the bar, its growls resonating through the walls, a constant reminder of the threat lurking outside. We took turns keeping watch, praying for dawn to come quickly. Every sound, every shadow, sent waves of panic through us. We were on edge, nerves frayed. It was around 3 a.m. when we heard it, a slow, steady knock on the door. Everyone jumped, hearts pounding in their chests. The knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. I took a deep breath and approached the door, the others following me. I looked through the glass pane of the door and felt my blood turn to ice. The stranger stood there, the wicked smile back on his face. His eyes bore into mine with a cold, merciless gaze. He pointed behind him, and my heart sank. There it was, the entity, towering and monstrous. Its eyes glowed with a ghastly light in the darkness. It was even more terrifying than I imagined. The entity stood there, a silhouette of pure terror against the darkened sky, its guttural growls shaking the bar's glass panes. The stranger's wicked smile widened as he beckoned towards the creature, a silent invitation to unleash chaos. We watched in horror, our worst nightmares brought to life before our eyes. Suddenly, the entity lunged, and a deafening crash echoed through the bar as the doors burst open from the impact. The patrons screamed, scattering in all directions. The stranger sauntered in, untouched by the chaos, the entity following behind him like a twisted pet. The bar was in an uproar. The entity stalked its prey, a cat toying with its terrified mice. Its cold, glowing eyes seemed to enjoy the pandemonium, the fear feeding its malevolent strength. Amid the chaos, I noticed something. The entity, it wasn't attacking. It was hurting us, driving us towards the stranger. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The entity wasn't the real threat. It was the stranger. With newfound determination, I rallied the patrons. We had to stand our ground. We had to fight. As we prepared to confront the stranger, I felt a strange sensation. Fear was giving way to courage, despair replaced by hope. We were in this together, and we were not going down without a fight. The showdown was intense. The stranger's confident grin never wavered, even as he found himself outnumbered. We fought back with everything we had, using makeshift weapons from the bar. Bottles, chairs, pool cues, anything that could be used as a weapon was in our hands. The entity roared in anger, the noise deafening, but we didn't back down. Just when we thought we were gaining an advantage, the entity lunged at us. I braced myself, waiting for the end, but it never came. Instead, a brilliant, blinding light filled the bar. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden brightness. Then I saw it. The entity was receding, wailing in agony, its form dissipating like smoke in the wind. Dawn had broken. The first rays of the sun had pierced the dark sky, and the entity was no match for the purifying light. The stranger, now cornered and without his monstrous pet, was apprehended by the patrons. The nightmare was finally over. As the first rays of the sun bulged through the shattered windows of the bar, the patrons let out a collective sigh of relief. The entity, once a horrific embodiment of nightmares, was now just a fading memory, dissipated by the break of dawn. But the stranger still stood, his smile not wavering even in defeat. The police arrived soon after, their flashing lights adding to the surreal scene. The patrons shared their accounts, each tale more bizarre than the last. As they carted the stranger away, his eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew we hadn't seen the last of him. In the aftermath of the chaos, the bar patrons found a newfound camaraderie. They helped rebuild the place, each piece of furniture, each repaired window, a testament to their shared survival. They were no longer strangers who shared drinks, but a family brought together by an unimaginable experience. The bar became a beacon of resilience in our little town. And I, the humble bartender, became the keeper of their stories, the chronicler of their courage. The tale of the last call echoed throughout the town, a chilling reminder of the night we all faced our worst fears. To this day, late-night patrons still share tales of the stranger and his entity. And while I listen, I can't help but glance at the now secure bar doors and the bright sunlit skies outside. Our town may be an ordinary speck on the map, but we're a community forged in supernatural fire, forever bound by a night of terror. So, the next time you visit a small, nondescript town and come across a bar named The Last Call, step inside. You'll find friendly faces, strong drinks, and a tale that you won't believe. But remember, every tale has a kernel of truth. After all, who would believe a bartender's story? And that brings us to the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did recounting it. Remember to share your thoughts, reactions, and any lingering questions you might have in the comments section. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you won't miss out on the next chilling tale. Until then, keep your wits about you. Who knows what lurks in the shadows? Saw something terrifying. On a camping trip with friends in the backwoods of southern Georgia, at my cousin's grandfather's property. Really old site, he didn't maintain it well. There was a large cabin/meeting house, lots of property, a lake and a large wooded area that we liked to explore. There was a river that wound through the woods, and we built huge forts along it. We camped by the shore of the lake. It was low, but on the opposite shore a huge ridge rose, with trees on either side. It reminded me of a carriage road. On our first night there, we stayed up until about 1. I needed to use the bathroom, so I went to the meeting house, since we slept in tents. It was a wood-paneled, ancient building full of animal heads, dark, with few working lights. I stepped in, turned on the light and paused. The animal heads had all positioned to be facing the door. Unnerved, I used the restroom, stepped out only to find them looking right at me, on the other side of the room from where they were looking last. I ran out, terrified, then realized I hadn't turned off the light. I looked back and was about to open the door to shut off the light when through the blinds, I saw a black, menacing figure in the corner of the room. This time the heads had swiveled to face it. Then, of its own accord, the lights shut off. I ran to my tent and zipped myself up. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, we were exploring the woods and discovered two places that, unbeknownst to us, would be the most terrifying places we had ever been later that night. We had built a fort along the river earlier that day, and were following the river up when we came across a peculiar structure. A large triangular fort-like place made of what appeared to be tree roots. It was like a lean-to and was covered on the sides and top like a pyramid, but one side was slightly open like an entrance. Near the structure in an opposite triangle were three very deep holes. We were careful not to step in these. Inside the structure was a triangle-like object on the floor, made of what appeared to be finely whittled wood, very old, and covered in an unrecognizable hieroglyph typewriting. We chose not to disturb this, but to mark the spot and give us an observation point. We laid logs across a nearby ditch in a Vietnam-style dugout and placed some large sticks with flags tied to them on top, so we could see the colors and know the spot. Then we found the ridge. The ridge started deep in the woods almost parallel to our campsite, then mooned to the lake and made up most of the opposite shore. We walked along it for about 15 minutes and noticed that the path was like a tree tunnel, and the fallen leaves were well trodden, the path flat, like a carriage trail. All of a sudden, we saw in the middle of the path an RV. Not just any RV, but an ancient RV from like the 60s, like a van. We walked up and inspected it. It was filled with dust, and the inside had obviously not seen daylight in years, with prominent sun marks on the seats. And yet, the inside was full of large boxed packages and files. I tugged on the handle and tried to enter, to my friend's delight. The door gave way and I found a file sitting on the seat. It was very dusty, so I slapped it against the dash, and the dust fell away to reveal very faded letters. The only non-faded or humidified characters were the large bold printed letters at the top. It read, GA Site 16, anomalous behavior detected. Structures common. Manifestation present. Keep high alert level. I noticed the boxes and pulled one over, opening the lid. It had a bunch of the finely whittled sticks, a gooey black substance in a jar, and what appeared to be an etched, polished metal sphere. The note in the box read, Station unsafe. Will begin remote monitoring. Situation still undefined. No further progress. Holes still prevalent. I was very puzzled, so I pulled over another paper lying on the seat. It seemed newer than the others, but still old, with a hole running along the edge. The decaying carcass of a bug lying stuck to the paper. I picked it up and read, GA Site 16, weekly instruction. Inspect lake floor in direction Bravo. Owner expected to arrive soon. Be ready to stow equipment. Another structure has appeared 0.6 miles away from your post, direction 223. End. I assumed the structures were referring to the wooden site, and that manifestation could refer either to weird occurrences or the black figure I had seen earlier. On our walk back, me and my friends felt like we were being watched, and I turned around to see a black figure dart behind a tree. We began to sprint, and I kept seeing it in my periphery. However, later that day we were brainstorming what it might have been, and I realized that the neighbors breeded black labs, and that the figure I saw was probably one of his dogs chasing us. We went fishing that afternoon, and I caught a large black eel, slick and eyeless. It had large teeth, and tried to snap at my fingers. I threw it back terrified, and it went back into the water. I discovered later that eels were not supposed to be living in that lake, and their appearance was unexpected. There was not a species nearby that matched what I had seen. That night we played manhunt, and I went deep into the woods and hid with a friend in the dugout we built near the structure. About 10 minutes into hiding, it's about 11:30, we saw a large black figure, about 10 feet in height, rise from the structure and start walking slowly towards our dugout. It was a low-to-the-ground dugout with an entrance in the front and the back. We sprinted out the back entrance and towards our tents. We turned and saw the creature sprinting after us, catching up quickly. Suddenly, the creature stopped and looked at the ridge like behind it at a very specific spot. It was a spot about 300 yards beyond the RV. Suddenly, there was a muzzle flash from the ridge, and the creature started getting pelted with rounds of some caliber. It screeched and began sprinting up the ridge, passing the RV in seconds. As it passed, the lights flickered on in the RV and then off again. The creature was beyond view in the darkness, but we heard screams of someone fat along the ridge. We slept inside the meeting house that night, and a thunderstorm rolled in. I woke up about 4 a.m. to see the creature standing about 10 yards away from the cabin windows, head obscured. I did a double take, and it was gone. That morning, we took some knives and walked to where the screams came from the night before. We could see that the shots had come from what we now realized was the neighbor's property. He stumbled over about 10 o'clock the next day to say that he had shot at the creature, thinking it was gonna go after his dogs. He was a fervent conspiracy theorist and thought it was Bigfoot. It had come after him, and he went inside his house and hid in his upstairs. Later that day, we saw a fire coming from the ridge and saw that the structure had burned to a crisp. That night, we were sitting in the pickup truck bed and saw the RV turn on and drive off the ridge into the lake. Before it hit the water rose up as if to grab the RV, and it was swallowed up. We freaked out, never camped there again.